Hello, everyone. This is John's Voice. This is the third episode. In this episode, we're going to be discussing a lot of what I've been talking about previously about the historicity of whether or not we can believe what's written in the Bible, whether or not it's true. And something occurred to me as I was thinking about this week's episode. Um, like every person who's ever been in a relationship, there is one thing that I think we can all agree on, and that is we instinctively know the truth. If you've ever had one of those relationships where you have somebody who's cheating on you, they're lying to you, there's something about that situation that I think when we step outside of it, once we're out of that environment that we're being lied to, and we kind of examine everything that happened there, most people always have this sense that they knew something was wrong. And I think a lot of that has to do is that we are wired for truth. I'll give you an example. Somebody's talking to you, and everything they're saying is, oh, baby, I didn't go there. I wasn't with this person. And yet everything in your body's telling you, yes, you did. You know it, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with when we see it, when we see someone looking at us, it's more than just what someone says. Okay, so when someone's speaking to you, at least from a lot of the research that I've done in psychology, the human brain has these, for lack of a better term, we'll call them jump off points. And so when I'm speaking to someone, and I know most of you have heard that 80% of a conversation is nonverbal, right? So you're reading certain signs based off of what they say. So if they're smiling, but they're not smiling with their eyes, or if they're nodding their head no, but they're saying something that's affirmative, it sends these signals that the brain picks up on and goes, wait a minute, something's not right. And we may not even identify it at first, simply because sometimes there's people that, we love them so much that we want to believe what they're saying is true. And even if it's a lie, we will do one more thing, which is lie to ourselves about what it is we're being told. Right? I think that's really where the betrayal portion comes in. It's not necessarily that you lied to me. It's the fact that you convinced me to lie to myself. That's the part where we feel the ultimate betrayal. Is that I wanted to believe all of these things about you that you were good, that you cared, that you loved me, but all of your actions and everything else says that's just not true, and I was a fool because I lied to myself. And I believe that we're geared for truth. And it's also evidenced in the fact that when you study human behavior, the one thing that I've learned to be true, and I think most people, police officers, detectives, here's what they pick up on. The human body hates to lie. The mouth lies, the brain lies, but the human body hates it. The human body's uncomfortable with it. And so when someone goes to tell a lie, if you've ever lied yourself, you know that it's like your heartbeat will speed up. You don't want to get caught. You're afraid of, the consequences of getting caught. And that's where what they call all of the tells start to show. And so I believe that human beings are geared for truth, that we love the truth. We hear the truth. We can embrace it because even if it's uncomfortable, I would say a lot of the problems that we have in our society today is that we just can't accept the truth, right? We can't accept the truth. And it seems like we're always looking at two sides of any argument when in fact there's three sides. There's your side, there's my side, and then the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think that's really what is happening a lot in our society today. Is that can two things be true at the same time? Like can one group of people commit more crimes than another group of people and find themselves confronting police officers more? That answer is true. Can also there be factions of police officers who go a little bit far, or go too far, I should say, go too far with their actions on their job, and that they mistreat people? That also can be true. Like, it doesn't have to be an either or. I see sides of people arguing today, and they forget that it's never either or. It can be both. And that's the only way a real discussion can ever be had, because you're operating from truth, not trying to make your side or argue for a side of this that I just want it to be true because I don't like the fact that I have to admit that there are factions on both sides who just don't represent me in either way. That's true. So now when we're turning back and we're looking at the Gospels and we're trying to determine, I do see that there are times what we'll do is we'll look at people who do believe it, and some people do blindly believe it. Like, they've never picked up the Bible, they've never read it, they go to church all the time, we watch their actions, we judge them based off of, their character, and their character repels us from embracing spirituality because we're not associating it with any sort of truth. We're associating it with, I just don't want to be like that person. I'll give you another example. All right, let's make it even more uncomfortable. There have been atrocities committed by people of faith, people who call themselves Christians. Priests abusing children. You know what? There's not a Catholic that I know of, and I've never had a conversation with a Catholic that said this is all made up. These people are just lying about priests. No, they're not. No, they're not. It is also true that there are priests who have done some despicable and horrendous things to children. And I can see how, at first myself, when I'm looking at whether or not I trusted Catholics, had everything to do with me judging the actions of people. And what I'll tell you is that anytime you look at the actions of people, you make a judgment call as to whether or not the thing that they do. Again, you go back to what we're talking about in society. Judging all people of color based on the actions of a few, judging all police officers based on the actions of a few, judging an entire religion based off the actions of a few. I know if there's Muslims listening to this, you understand that as well. That the tenets of your faith can be hijacked by a group of people who seek to push an ideology that doesn't really represent what you yourself believe, but because you have the title of being that, then of course people look at you a certain way, and then they judge whether or not they want to be a member of this group. And I'm here to tell you that that's just not how truth works. Like, it's not popular. We made this mistake in our society that we judge everything based on the majority. So it's easy to show the flaw in that thinking because over 90% of Germans agreed with what Hitler was doing. Over 90% of Africans agreed with enslaving people and selling them to other countries. Over 90% of people in the United States agreed that accepting people in trade for goods was a good idea. It wasn't a problem until somebody challenged it and realized that this is not how we should be conducting ourselves, right? Because that's the thing about the truth. It doesn't matter what the majority think about it, it still continues to be true. I think I even said that on the first episode. The truth is like rain. It doesn't care who it falls on. And if you sit with it long enough, it starts to resonate with you. To the point to where it doesn't matter what the vast majority of people think. It if it is true, I would rather be alone in serving the truth than to stand with billions of people in a lie. If I'm the only person standing, if I'm the last person who ever teaches this message, that Jesus Christ is the truth, and that when we die, there is a place, and science can even point that there is something after death. I'll get into that into another episode. But if I'm the last person that holds this truth, then so be it. Let the whole world judge me because of it. I have no problem with that, because it is true. And I'll use this as an example. I will not here cite a Bible verse unless it's within the context to kind of look at what someone said. But in other words, I'm not going to tell you that, well, because the Bible says it, it's true. I'm not going to say that. Because, in fact, you have to know that what the Bible is. I made the mistake for years of believing that, the Bible was a book that was written by men. Men are flawed. And that even the ideology behind this, what I finally come to understand, is that the Bible is not a book at all. I know you look at it, you see it's bound together, you see the pages, you see a book. The Bible is actually a library, right? It's a compilation of writings from different people and different sources that have been put together. So no different than if I wanted to learn about who Abraham Lincoln is, I go down to the library. I can find an encyclopedia. I can find a biography. I can find historical documents. I can find American history literature. I can even find a book that tells me that he was a vampire killer. It just depends on what section of the library that I'm in, right? But when it comes to God and when it comes to who Jesus was, sometimes those books in the Bible, you just have to know what section of the library that you're in, right? The atheist in me, when I first heard the story of Job inside a whale, absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's no way that a man's going to live inside the belly of a whale. I just couldn't accept it. But I also come to understand that there are writers who can speak in allegory. Now, does that mean that, or John, so you're saying that you don't believe that portion of the Bible? I'm telling you that the atheist ideology in me says, or at least the science behind it just says it's not possible. The stomach acids of a whale would destroy a man. I don't know how that's possible. So that's one of those things that I said, okay, what is really the context of that? What do I get out of it? Is it possible that a man can be trapped inside of something that's larger than himself? I don't know what the allegory behind it was. I don't know if there is something else that's factual there that I just can't see. But what I can tell you, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus and the historicity of it, while I understand it seems completely unbelievable, I want to offer you up some facts. Now, when I use the word facts, I want you to understand that a fact must be evidenced by multiple sources, okay? And 90% of scholars, they will allow the historicity of something being a fact when you do have multiple sources. And there's over 100 critically ascertained facts regarding the resurrection of Jesus. So it's not the Bible that will cite this. And like I said, we can use some of the things that are there in context, but what I will use for you are sources that, and again, you look them up yourself. If you want to challenge me on it, or you don't want to believe it, again, that's always your choice. You always have that alternative of choice. But here's what I can tell you. That the sources that point to whether or not this happened, and I will break it down. I started to look at, so we know that there's all of these things about Jesus, right? There's the Shroud of Turin, there is the Sudarium of Oviedo, there is the Spear of Destiny, But there's also other people, right? Not gospel writings. There are writings from historians outside of the Bible that confirm for us that in the simplest terms, there was a innocent man put to death at the time, Josephus, who was he was a historian. He had written down that Jesus was put to death. Jesus was put to death by Pilate. There was a lot of uproar about it. Apparently, he was an innocent man. That he was wanted for crimes of sorcery in the town of Bethsaida. So that's outside the Bible. That's not a Bible source. And in fact, the writers outside the Bible, I will give you, there was the Roman historian Tacitus, the Josephus, who was the Jewish historian. There is the Talmud. There is the Lucian of Samosata. There is the Mara Bar Serapion. There is the writings of Thales, and trying to understand, what caused the darkness when Jesus died. There are the Acts of Pilate, which is from Justin Martyr. There are the Gnostic works, such as the Gospel of Truth. There is the Gospel of Thomas. There are the treatises on resurrection. I mean, there are multiple sources outside of the Bible. And here are, I'll give you 12 minimal facts. And a lot of this comes from the research. I spent a lot of time listening to probably one of the most profound thinkers, Gary Habermas. He has a minimal facts approach to being able to look at the gospel. And here are the 12 minimal facts. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. That is a fact. He was buried, most likely in a private tomb. Without using the Bible, most likely in a private tomb. Soon afterwards, the disciples, they were discouraged, they were bereaved, despondent, and they lost hope. Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his interment. The disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. And due to those experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. They were willing to die for that belief. That is considered a historical fact. Not because the Bible said so, historical fact. The proclamation of resurrection took place very early at the very beginning of the church history, so very close to the event. People started to believe this very close to the resurrection. Disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly thereafter. The gospel messages that they were teaching were centered on the death and resurrection of Jesus. Sunday was the primary day at that time for gathering and worshiping. James, the brother of Jesus, who was a former skeptic, was converted when he believed and he saw the risen Jesus. And just a few years later, a man named Saul of Tarsus, also commonly referred to as Paul, he becomes a Christian believer due to an experience that he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. Now, those are facts, historical facts, with sources that can back those up that are not the Bible itself. So, depending on who you're talking to, if you're talking to let's use Muslims, for example. So Muslims will confirm that there was a man named Jesus. And they'll grant many of the things that I'm discussing right here. But when it comes to the historical crucifixion of Jesus, though, they will reject that. And even though they'll grant you that the historical records are accurate, they will sometimes use somebody else died in Jesus' place. And in the Quran, it will tell you that nobody killed Jesus, nor they crucified him, but another person was made to resemble Jesus. And who did this? Well, Allah did this. And they will say it's because Allah loved Jesus and he did not want Jesus to suffer or whatever. But Muslims are convinced that Jesus did not die on the cross. Now, I have heard Muslim apologists on a debate go as far as to grant the fact that Jesus might have been crucified, but he did not die on the cross. He either survived the crucifixion or Allah raised Jesus and putting somebody else in Jesus' place. Now, here's the problem with that. And I too will admit to you that there was a time that I believed they stole the body. They stole the body, they pulled it out, they put somebody else in there. I'm telling you, there is enough historicity on the event. They were aware of that at that time as well, that somebody might steal the body, which is why they placed guards around this tomb. They wanted to place guards there to keep that from happening, and that is confirmed by the Romans at that time. So these were not Christians who were saying, hey, they put a bunch of guards around there so we could. No, these were Romans. Romans placed guards around this tomb because of the fear that someone might steal this body and try to say that. So if you'll remember, as I said before, when you're trying to prove history, when you have the rebels, the ones who are against this, these Romans at that time were not Christians. We can point to the fact that there were a group of soldiers called out to guard the tomb to keep it from being stolen. That's a fact. Now, if it were that the body was stolen, this would have certainly been easy to prove. But what you start to realize is that if this body had been stolen, then help me to understand how so many people saw the man that they witnessed put to death again. I mean, when we're talking about the conversion, and this is one of those times where I only use the Bible for the context of, is that Paul is a person who was there to persecute Christians, right? So if he's persecuting them, and then he sees this Jesus on the road to Damascus, it presents one of the best finds that you can have when you're trying to discover historicity, is that a person who was against him, who is now all of a sudden for him, and Paul does not win anything in this. In other words, the Jews are going to want to kill him for who he is, right? This man is a Pharisee. He has the ability that he himself could have been on the Sanhedrin. He was destined for that. And so he loses everything by claiming that he saw this man Jesus on the road to Damascus. And then furthermore, the Christians are never going to trust him because they know who he is. They know that this is the man who was sent to kill Christians. So, in other words, he doesn't win with either side. So either side of this group has the ability to reject him immediately and offer you up the evidence that this is all lies. The only problem is it's not there. So now when we're determining things like the historicity of Jesus, there is enough historical record that you can't deny that Jesus was a person who existed. So let's kind of, we'll pause right there with the Jesus, and let's look at the apostles, right? So sometimes, and again, there's debate over whether it's 31 to 33 AD when Jesus was crucified. But shortly after, it was his followers, closest followers, they were known as the 12, right? And so all of these people that were close to him, so the belief that I had before is, well, they could have all lied. And while certainly I understand that context, I started to think, okay, well, let's look at the historical perspective of who the 12 were. So there's only one apostle that I would say, you could say, died of natural causes, which is John. But the rest of them, they were martyred. And they were martyred for what it was they were saying. So they're claiming that this man who was put to death, he had risen again, that he was God, which was blasphemous. So when we look at all of the things associated with it, it was like, well, if that shroud bears this image, then why didn't they just use that? We're talking, again, we're in 33 AD. Any Jew that would have been caught with this sudarium or this shroud on them, this is forbidden. You can't take something from the tomb. These are tainted. It is forbidden for you to own these things, which is why they would have hidden these away. It's not something that you would have wanted to hold up and show everybody, for the simple reason that this is not going to go well for you. And even their testimony alone, it didn't go well for them, as most of them were martyred. I started to look at each of them, and so look, we got Simon Peter, we got Andrew, we got James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, Jude, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot, Matthias, and Paul. And so, can you infer something just from how did they die? Like, let's set aside the belief and let's look at how did they die, right? So we'll take Peter. Peter was crucified. So again, very common, right? Crucifixion. But Peter, when he was crucified, they hung him up on his cross upside down. History says that he requested this because he didn't feel that he should be crucified in the same manner as Jesus. This is coming from the Roman history, not from the Bible. But the history teaches us that Peter was crucified in Rome with his head downwards, as he himself had desired to suffer. Now, Romans were known for experimenting with different variations of crucifixion. And again, this one comes from Josephus. Roman soldiers didn't always crucify people right side up, because they would try different positions for just entertainment. But we do have evidence historically that Peter requested this. So not only does the man not recount his story as to what he saw, but he's willing to go even further to say, not only if you're going to kill me for this, you can just flip me upside down, because I don't want to be crucified in the same manner that Jesus was. So now anything that Peter's got to say, you kind of got an ear for me, because if you're wanting to at least assert that there is a fact and a truth, you show me somebody who is willing to die for it. Like Martin Luther King said, if a man hasn't found something worth dying for, he isn't fit to live. And here I have Peter, not only not recanting his testimony, he could have easily said, hey, we stole the body. Like he could have made a ploy to find some sort of way to get out of what he was facing. But instead, he goes even further and he says, no, just turn me upside down. I don't deserve to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus. So again, that put a big question mark on me for that's pretty a solid testimony to see what Peter's got to say. And also Peter's brother Andrew, allegedly, he suffers the same kind of death. It's not as reliable, at least the sources and the facts behind Andrew is not as reliable as what we have. Andrew was martyred by crucifixion in the Greek city of Patras around 60 AD. And Peter didn't consider himself worthy to die in the same way. So he was tied to the cross, not nailed. And the cross to which Andrew hung may have been X-shaped instead of kind of T-shaped. That's the reason why you'll see like an X-shaped cross sometimes. That's referred to as the St. Andrew's cross, and that's the reason why. But I don't know that I can trust the source of this. It comes from the apocryphal book, which is again not a biblical resource, but it comes from the Acts of Andrew. Andrew gives a lot of supernatural accounts, and he includes the claim that he preached for 3 days straight as he hung on the cross and didn't emerge until decades, maybe even centuries after his death. So again, I'll put a question mark over his account, right? This writing that occurred, but he was crucified for what he believed. He was crucified for not recanting who Jesus was. So again, whether or not you accept the Acts of Andrew, again, I'd stand right there with you and say, yeah, there's not enough reliability in it. So, okay. But was he crucified? Was he put to death for what he was saying? He was. James. And this is one of the first apostles to Jesus that dies following Jesus. He gets executed with a sword by King Herod. And, scholars will argue about James. Allegedly, it's believed he was killed in Jerusalem around 44 AD because Jews were very interested in preventing Christianity from spreading. And so Herod, he believes in persecuting Christians. And this made a lot of the Jews happy when they would do this because these people were said to be committing blasphemy, right? So Eusebius of Caesarea, he was quoted as saying, "It appears that the guard who brought him into court was so moved when he saw him testify that he confessed that he too was a Christian." And so they're both taken away together, and on the way he asked James to forgive him. And James thought about it for a moment, and he says, "I wish you peace," and he kissed him. And they both get beheaded at the same time. Now that's according to Eusebius of Caesarea. And so, again, I'll bring in a Bible resource. This is one of the first apostles who drank the cup that Jesus drank at the Last Supper. And so, again, here's another one. John. Tradition says that he died of old age. There are several historical accounts as to whether or not it was natural causes. It's not firmly established, at least according to the historical record. But when Mary died, John allegedly went to Ephesus, and he wrote three epistles there. From there, he was exiled to the island of Patmos for preaching the gospel, and then he received a revelation from Christ. He writes the book of Revelation, and he makes it back to Ephesus. He dies like an ordinary death sometime around 98 AD. That allows us to assume that John the Apostle and John of Patmos are the same person. There's kind of a question mark as to whether that may be true historically. We don't know. Tertullian, a Christian writer from the late 2nd to early 3rd century, wrote that before the Romans banished John, they brought him into a Colosseum and dunked him in a vat of boiling oil. When he emerged unharmed, the entire Colosseum converts to Christianity. There's even some iconography that does show John being dipped into a vat of boiling oil. Again, it's not biblical. It's not in the Bible. There is an account of this from Tertullian, not a Bible source. Philip. Philip, he's an evangelist. According to the book of Acts, he's an evangelist. Can't say for sure which accounts are referring to which Philip, right? But there's some conflicting stories there. Polycrates of Ephesus, he wrote a letter, and he said, "I speak of Philip, one of the 12 apostles who is laid to rest at Hierapolis." So there's another one, Caius, the presbyter, and he said, "And after this there were 4 prophetesses, daughters of Philip, at Hierapolis in Asia. Their tomb is there, and that too of their father. So this appears to be talking about Philip the evangelist, and he had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. That's according to Acts. And it's unlikely that both Philips had 4 prophesying daughters, right? So we can kind of ascertain from that this is the same Philip. Not a very detailed account on his martyrdom. It's hard to say whether or not you can trust it. But again, we have another person that is martyred or said to be martyred. So when you start to look at, and rather than go through all of the apostles, I put together, where was it at? I put together just basically to look over each one of them, how did they die, and then whether or not the degree of certainty of them could be trusted. And most of them, like I will tell you that of the 12, there are some of them that I would even stand there with you and go, okay, the historical record is not very clear on them, but you can say with certainty that they were put to death because of their faith. Where the question comes in is the manner in which that they died, as to whether or not, they were hung upside down, whether or not they were beheaded or stabbed. But at the end of the day, when you watch it all, you push it all off to the side, they were all put to death because of what they believed. Now, Judas is the one that, because of his betrayal, he commits suicide. So, even the evidence around the 12 apostles that he had suggests that whatever it is that they saw, it impacted them to the point that even at the point of death, they're not changing their stories. I challenge you to find 12 people today who get caught for doing something that's against the law, and none of them break. None of them say whose idea it was, what the plot was, what the plan was, and they go so far with it that even given the opportunity to be set free, they choose death rather than to be set free. It's unheard of. And then we can look at the world, like you look at where these apostles went, what it was that they taught, how did the church become what it is today? And I will challenge you that if you study the history, just the history of Christianity, the history of Christianity will take you to Catholicism. For the biggest argument that we have today of where Christians will, the Protestants are so focused on what the Bible is, what it says, and it's known as sola scriptura, like the Bible alone is all you need. But one has to just look at this for a second and go, where did this book come from? Because initially the people that were professing their belief in Christianity, in who Jesus was, they didn't write anything down. Now, I will tell you the argument that I had before was that, well, nobody wrote anything down because I had believed this sort of atheistic viewpoint of that, well, can you really trust anything that comes from the Bible because it happened so, these people didn't write anything until after he died. Yes, you can. I said on a previous episode that when we looked at Alexander the Great, the closest we can get to any writings during Alexander the Great's life is about 427 years after Alexander the Great had died. There was no one alive at that time who had served with, who knew of 427 years before Alexander the Great. It was an oral tradition that was passed down, and 427 years later it gets written down. And there's not a person today who questions Alexander the Great. But when we go and look at the Bible, there's not a person right now, even your atheists, even atheist scholars will grant you that the book of Acts, which is written by Paul, Acts was written to a leader who was in charge at that time So you have Acts. Corinthians is another one that this was written around 50, 51 AD because we know who was in charge in Corinth at that time. And so we're talking the crucifixion occurs around 31 to 33 AD, and we've got a letter going to Corinth that is around 50 to 51 AD. So we're not 400 years removed from the event of Jesus' crucifixion. We're less than 20 years away from it with that letter. So this notion that, well, all these writers, they wrote so far after he died on the cross, and so we can't trust them. That's just not true. To be able to like scientifically date it, there's issues that come up, at least as being able to date it. But when we're talking about the eyewitnesses' accounts of this, what struck me to be the most evident of whether or not you can accept the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When you have a historical document that is nothing more than a letter going to Corinth, and everything that Paul is saying in this letter to Corinth points back to he had talked to the eyewitnesses at that time, and he accepted this testimony. And again, I've got no reason to doubt Paul. Then I start looking at what he said. And that is where I started to realize, this is an eyewitness account of a man who had a very impactful event on the road to Damascus. And I'm like, what is that event? Well, the resurrected Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus. So if I'm looking for the claim that did anybody see this resurrected man after he was put to death, Paul certainly offers testimony that that is what happened to him. So, in studying just the nature of that, just the nature of it, it became very clear to me that I had to research now, not just can I trust the historicity of it, but now what did it say? And you see, there was three things that I come away from. Three things that I can't get around, whether I go to the Bible or whether I go to outside sources. Fact number one, there was an innocent man named Jesus who was put to death. He was innocent. He was declared innocent. The Pilate at that time washed his hands of the whole situation and said he could find no fault with him. That is a fact. Second fact, that man was placed in a tomb. It wasn't his, right? It wasn't meant for his body. It was meant for someone else's. That is a fact. He was placed in a tomb that did not belong to him. Third and final fact, that man that was placed in that tomb was seen by many people after he was put to death. Those are three basic historical facts that you just cannot escape if you study what he said. Those three accounts stand up to a historical review, and you can't deny that. So now the question is, and Jesus made this so, it's a huge conundrum, because if you say, okay, well, I can accept the historical fact of Jesus was a man, yes, he was put to death, I can accept all of that, but maybe he lied about it all. Here's the conundrum you're in. We don't have we have people even today who claim to be God. But we don't have people today that are put to death because of it. We also don't have people who claim to be it who get seen again after they've died. We don't have any evidence of people leaving an imprint on a non-photographic surface that bears a scientific testament, silently sitting there saying there was something about this man that is not like anything you've ever seen before. When I'm confronted with all of those facts, you still have the ability. The beautiful part about free will is that you still have the ability to deny all of it. But what I can tell you is, denying the truth does not make it any less the truth. In fact, all it does is cause you to live a lie. Because if you won't look at the evidence and you won't research it for yourself, then either one, you blindly follow it, and I would tell you there's also a danger in that. Please don't take anything I say here as fact. By all means, do your own research, read it for yourself, experience it for yourself, and then when you finally get to the very end of it, don't just tell me what you believe, but tell me why you believe what you believe. Because I can tell you this, I do not believe in Jesus. I know that he is who he says he is. The belief is in the things that I cannot see. That's where my belief is at. I do believe that he was the Son of God. But I know